Hello, and welcome to stream today. We are in the middle of, actually at the end of developing our Eleventy RSS reader. So we've been building up this kind of Jamstack app, is another way to think about it. So using the static site generator Eleventy. All right, so with our RSS app, we are at the end. We're ready to style it up and get it in a place where if we were to push it up to a production site, which I might push it up to a temporary URL, we would be able to have it working, have it readable and ready to go. The other thing with this project is that we are developing it so that it can be used as a starter. And our progress so far can be found in this GitHub repo, which I'll also add into the chat. And we're not going to talk too much about what we've done with Eleventy today, although we have a tiny bit left to do before we jump into styling. The biggest focus today is going to be on styling. If you're less familiar with me, CSS is kind of my thing. So I write the blog moderncss.dev and a handful of other projects. So if you're here to see me use a CSS framework, that's not what we're doing today. We're going to see how we can use modern CSS and get our app styled up pretty quickly. So hopefully you learn some new things as we go through that process. The last link I'll drop in the chat is I also manage the site eleventy.rocks. So if you do want to learn more about Eleventy, this project we've been building is a kind of intermediate to advanced level project. So if you are looking for something more beginner level, there's if you go to the post archive here, I definitely would jump you first to this article. That's a walkthrough, and it also has a video walkthrough. I joined Ava a few months ago on stream to go through Eleventy. And then also off of the home page, you can get to a 3-minute overview video and a pro course with Egghead. And now let's look at what we had so far for our application. So we have zero style, except for changing the font to sans serif. But the progress we have so far is pretty much what we need in order to make this a working application that is useful for us as an RSS reader. So what we're looking at, and it is a little difficult without some styling, but we have divided our feeds into categories. So we have a CSS, an Eleventy, and a podcast category. And then within each of those, there are different sources. So that's represented by these titles here. And then a list of up to 3 items for each of those sources, at least in this homepage view. And then we are able to click in and view a scoped down view of the category, and then a scoped down view of an individual source. And then finally, like a big portion of what we'll be doing today is styling up the individual item view. And of course, this is going to be interesting because we have a lot of different scenarios. We don't know what the incoming content is going to be. The best we can do is hope that it's decently semantically marked up so that we can style some common elements and get a decent reading experience regardless of what the source is. So that'll be our most unique challenge for today. But first, we do have just a couple small things we didn't quite get to at the stream last Tuesday. The first thing I want to do is I want to add some more sources. So we have more content for us to be able to use as we're styling things. So I'm going to go into my app here, and we had those cordoned off into this feeds directory. And then each category has its own JSON file. If you were not with us on previous streams, the reason we're doing it this way is because, again, Eleventy is a static site generator, so we don't have a database where we can kind of input this information. And we didn't get to the point where we're feeding in from a headless CMS or something like that. That would also be a possibility for this management. But for now, we're keeping them as local JSON files. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a few more sources into my CSS category, and it's going to take a minute to build. Now, and another interesting thing about this being static is it does take a little bit of time to build, and this time is going to increase as we add RSS sources because it does take time to reach out and process. I've also had a dip in my internet connectivity lately, which is fun. So I've also noticed that it is a bit dependent on your, local speed. So if we push this out to a production server, I will probably see better times on this than I am locally. The other nice thing about it is that this is only an impact on build. So since this processing to reach out and grab the feeds and the information is not happening client side, it's going to be extremely snappy for once it is built and you're just looking at the views of it. At that point, it's just static content. So a cool thing to keep in mind for this particular project and how we're building it. So it's not React, it's not Gatsby, it's Eleventy. So, all right. So we added some more sources. We can see those have populated in. We had not gotten quite to the view of our individual items page. So we had to, the thing remaining here is to update the header. Now we did look at how to do this for one of our other views, our main category view. And we looked at how we could use template variables in order to adjust the display here, because they're all feeding into and displaying out of this base template and, layout would be the term here. So what we looked at in order to adjust the category page is we're doing this if check to modify the behavior so that we can show that new count and also link out to that site URL. So we're going to do something similar. Again, we just ran out of time last Tuesday. And we're going to go into our items and we have to enable a bit more information so that we can use it to modify that layout. So I'm just getting my reference material pulled up. We'd already added the title, whether or not it was new, and the source. But in order to get the rest of the information that we need for that header, as we showed in our wireframe, we're also going to add in the date and the link, which is going to be the link to the external source, so the permalink for this. And then also we'll make sure we have access to the original site URL as well, because we're going to use that to display. All right, so we'll save that. It's not going to have any visual impact yet, so we'll stay in VS Code. But what we're going to be able to do now is go back to our base layout and we'll just update this if loop. And I'm going to be copying this today because I do want to get to the styling. And so I'm going to go ahead and just copy what's going on here. So one thing is we were previously checking for just site URL to find out if we were on the categories page. But now we're going to have that also incoming for the items page. We still have a unique value, so we're just going to make this a slight bit more complex. For our category specific page, now we're checking if we have the site URL and not the link. And by the way, we're in Nunjucks, so if this syntax looks a little funky, that's why. So we actually literally say and not for this syntax. So this first one is the same category as we did before. And now we're checking else if we have the site URL, or in this case, we could say actually link. Might help make it a little more clear of what we're doing. We could also add some comments in here. And we're going to include this post date partial that we created in the last stream. And then we're outputting the title and then finally outputting this view link. So what we've just accomplished doing is we added the updated our header. So this is what is now appearing for that. And so we've got the date coming in, the headline, and then finally this link out to the original source. So that was the update we just made. And that about gets us to our wireframes, our underlying semantics. There's one more nice to have that we didn't get to, and that is being able to customize the name of our site. Right now, we don't really have a name of our site. On our homepage, it just says feeds. So it would be kind of nice, since we're thinking of this as ultimately being a starter that we share. So folks such as yourselves can pick this up, modify it for your own needs. A convention I tend to use, and you'll see in other starters in slightly different maybe naming conventions, is within our data file. And let me scope this down so we can see better. within our data file, we're going to create a file called meta.js. And we're just going to populate one thing for now. We're going to export out a site title. Now, again, we talked in previous streams that this data file is an expected directory from Eleventy, and anything that gets created here in an acceptable format is going to be accessible throughout any of our templates and layouts with Eleventy, and it's accessible via the actual file name here. So with that in place, we can go back to our index file, and this title's fine here, but that's what's currently populating our visual layout. But we're going to swap that, and we're going to do one more if else inside of our header here. So we did it for our category, we did it for our individual page, and this is kind of our generic catch-all right now. That's what's displaying that feeds title. But instead, we're going to check for our home page. And the way we can do that with Eleventy is to check if the incoming data does not include a file slug. So since it's the index page, it's not actually saving a file slug because it's the root. So there is no slug that is appended there. So this is a quick way to check if you are displaying the home page. Now, it won't work for other indexes if they're nested, but it works for our home page. So now we'll switch it to, instead of displaying the incoming front matter title, we'll instead display that site title that we just populated in the metadata file. And I will jump us back to the home page. And there we go. So this is now the title of our website. And one last thing that I thought it would be nice to have is, because of how we're having to scope this content, we're currently scoping it for the previous 90 days. And it would be nice to expose that date, I think, so that we could actually inform somebody visiting this how long that data is being fetched, and just kind of as a nice to have for ourselves. So if we know that we would like to look at older content, that it won't be something that's being pulled into our site. All right, so where we're currently getting that data, defining that date, is within our file that is fetching our different feeds. And again, this is explained way more depth in our earlier streams. We are at the final stream if you are just joining us for this project. So we're going to move this out, and we're going to create in our data directory. We're going to move it into here. We're going to call it the same name we had before for the variable. And instead, we will switch this to be an export. And that way we can get it wherever we need to. And of course, we need to come back in here and make sure we grab it again so we don't lose it from here, and break our script. And so since we are within a different data file, that's why we're having to import it, require it, because using it directly out of the data, as we saw in our template tag here, is only available in templates and layouts. So a little switch of how we manage it, but still works, still works in the build process. One thing about that is that we're also going to do is we're going to set this back just a little bit farther, again, just for our development purposes right now, to give us a bit more data to work with. So that's going to chug a little bit longer because it's going to allow more items to come through for that build. So now that we have that, we want to output it on our homepage and create a header element with it. But right now it's giving us a timestamp, like a literal a string of numbers for the time. And that's not exactly a readable format, generally speaking, if you're not a computer. So we did several things last week, or excuse me, I keep saying last week, but Tuesday, where we added quite a few filters. We learned a lot about those. So definitely jump back to that stream if you want a little more explanation on the filters we have available. But we're going to create one in order to make this a more readable format. We're going to call it date limit display. And we're using the library Luxon, which is bundled with Eleventy. It's like a subset of Moment, to my understanding. Anyway, so that's where all these functions are coming from, is Luxon. You'll see that included at the top of the config file here. So now that we have that filter available, we'll go back into our base and we're going to add that as an extra little bit of information below the title. So we're going to say fetching results since. We're going to pull in the timestamp value. So that's going to be coming from our data here. And, oh, I guess I called it not data limit, date limit. That would have broken our thing there. All right, sorry about that. Moving too fast, breaking things. All right, so we're pulling in that data point, and then we're passing it through our filter. And let's save that and make sure it displayed okay over here. It's going to take a minute. It's been working on building. So there we go. That's our new thing we just added. So fetching results since, and then this is now the more readable date of how long results are coming in for. That gets us the little bit of extra templating things that we didn't quite get to, and now we're gonna have to move super fast on styling because that took longer than I was expecting. All right, so we have our different views available. In terms of like structurally and semantically, they now match what I'm showing here now for our wireframes. Now our wireframes are kind of a hint at what we're going to do styling wise. We're not necessarily going to be matching this purple. The purple was just for wireframe's sake, to indicate what was a link. So that's what's going on here. But we're going to accomplish this card layout. Certainly style our typography, style this little number bubble, which is indicating how many new items we have, and get as far as we can for styling the content that may be coming in for each individual item. So let's get going on that. One other thing is when we created our repo for this, we used my template for the Eleventy SAS skeleton. So we've already got SAS processing in place. So I will be using SAS just to help us organize our files, but we're not going to use really too many other features of SAS in this particular goals that we have for it today. But just to mention that part of it's already done. There's not any inherent SAS build process to Eleventy. It is something you have to add if you would like it, but if you are interested, this SAS skeleton truly has nothing in it besides the SAS processing and an index file. So there's that link if you're interested. And so when we look at our what we have in here for styles, I'm going to close everything else out. We have a SAS directory, and the only thing we have in here is we are simply changing things to sans serif, and then I always like to do an off-white because the bright white is a little too much for me these days. Anyway, so that's the only thing we have in here. One interesting thing we're going to have, I'm a very active saver, and we of course want to save frequently so we can see our changes. We are going to have a little bit delayed build process. I'm thinking if I want to, yeah, I unfortunately won't be able to separate that out. So just a heads up that normally this would process very, very quickly. We're going to have a little delay just because it's going to continue grabbing the feeds. Eleventy does have a method or a plugin to help you do caching. I was not able to successfully integrate it into our particular solution because I am not a node expert, and the way that the feeds package is working is it's streaming in data. And so it wasn't quite working to intercept that and fetch it from a cache and still have the stream behavior, just based on my own knowledge. If anybody knows how to do that, I would super love that as a PR to improve this, because it would definitely be nice if for local development, it's not continually fetching the feed. So putting that out there as an ask for anybody that does know how that could be resolved. You know, we're only going to add what we need, first of all. So the first thing we're going to add is a reset. And for this, I like to use, for every project, I use Andy Bell's Modern Reset. And so if you're not familiar, it's got a nice article out here that really explains each part of it. And oftentimes I would remove some of the things that I know are not needed for my application. However, we're going to have some different elements that we may not even expect because of how we're pulling in whatever from an external RSS feed. So I'm going to leave everything that's in here just in case. And then we'll jump back to our style and we'll do a use and point to our reset. So I'm not going to super explain Sass things. Like I said, we're pretty much only going to use it to help us be able to create different files and compile them together today. All right, so I'm going to add a layout file, and I use this to set up my base layout elements. And for this application, also, we don't really need too much of a color theme in my view. So I'm not going to really worry about picking colors. I'm going to lean on the browser. We might decide we want to change link colors or something. But we also only have about half an hour. So we're going to work with what the browser gives us, which is what I like to do anyway. We haven't added any classes. The only class that we've actually added is one to this inclusively hidden class. And I'm going to go ahead and do that before we get too far. And I always search out for this because it's a series of properties so that assistive technology can read that content, but it is visually hidden. So here we go. And the way we were using that is so that we could use kind of a generic visual label for view on and then the domain, but we're using the inclusively hidden in a few places to be able to tuck away the actual article title. So that way, a user of assistive technology doesn't just get a bunch of view original or view on links with no other context of what they're going to be going to. All right, so we just wanted to make sure we got that in there. So often what I like to do is, so this is a controlled scoped app, right? We know the layout, it's not changing on us. So, in these cases, using element selectors is completely fine, right? We're not building a design system or a framework. So it's okay. We want this to automatically have commonalities throughout our views. So what I like to do with, actually I have one more thing to do. I want to set up some stuff in my body. All right, I like to set up a min height. We probably won't need it for this particular application because of all the RSS content likely will fill the screen regardless, but just in case. And then in our header, we're going to give that a min height as well. I just feel like it looks nice. And we're going to do a display of grid. And then this is the most modern way to center content. So we've got it set up to display grid, and we're going to use place content center. The other thing I forgot to do, which doesn't help in us seeing our changes, is I forgot to include that in. What that has done is centered any of our title or other meta content within that header area. Now, a key thing about this particular thing is it's not going to center text content. It will appear to center it if there's only one item. A lot of the things I'm going to show you today, you can also review over on my project smallcss.dev. So the centering method is represented out here. So for example, what I just mentioned, I do have extra styles to center the text, but if I didn't, it would not also center text. That has to be an additional style we add if we want that. But it does center overall, as you see, the items within the space. The next thing we want to do is we have our main element, and we'd like to essentially use this to add a bit of constraints to how big the content can be. And for this, my new favorite trick with modern CSS is to use this minimum function. And so it's going to select from an array of options that we give it. It's going to always pick the minimum computed, in this case, width. So we're going to pass it in 120 ch, and the ch unit is roughly equivalent to the 0 width character in whatever font we have. So right now we're inheriting from browser styles. And so it's whatever that sans serif font is. And then, so it's going to pick 120 CH if it's on a widescreen, but we want to make sure that there's no overflow. So if we only defined 120 CH, we would get overflow on narrower viewports. So a really cool thing about min and also other functions like max and clamp is that we can do additional math in here, and we don't even need to drop in a nested calc, although you can if you would like a little more clarity. So we're going to do 100 view widths minus 2 rem. And the reason I subtract 2 rem is that as the viewport narrows, we'll still have a little buffer. So rather than padding, we'll just have a little buffer based on the width. And then we'll do a margin left of auto and a margin right of auto to center our content. So the other thing is that once we start populating our views, there's essentially just a series of lists. We do have some heading levels that we're dealing with actually, we can probably at least look at our wireframe so we know what we're talking about. We have these heading levels to deal with, and then we have these cards, and each of those cards are going to be list items. So at this point, it would be helpful. We could go ahead and style our H2s. I'm going to lean on browser styles for that for now. But at this point, it would be probably helpful to add a class for our card so we can distinguish that from other list items that we have on the page. So in our previous streams, we had created this partial to hold this source card partial. So that is going to represent one of these cards and all its data. So let's go ahead and give that a class of card. And we could keep it in our layout. We could keep it a little more organized. We're really only having this one component in this particular app, so we won't bother nesting it into like a components directory or something. All right, so we have our card. And we just want to give it some very, very light touch styling options. We're going to give it some padding. I'm going to start with 1 rem. I like to use rems rather than pixel values throughout most of my spacing. I sometimes use viewport units, which we saw when I used 30 view height for the heading. And then we know that we have a nested list inside of there. So in this case, we could add a class, but we could just style it as a descendant selector. We will do one thing here, which is to add role list, because we're going to be removing this styling of a list with CSS. And an interesting side effect of that is that for some assistive technology, it will also stop announcing it as a list. And interestingly, from Andy's the reset that we added, there is actually this rule in here that if it includes that attribute, it's automatically going to assume that you're removing list style, because there wouldn't be another reason to add that role on there. The other thing we need to still do, though, is remove padding and remove margin from strictly the list element. Okay, so here's what we've accomplished so far. We've centered the header as we discussed. We've added the card class up here and remove styling from the list. So we're making some progress. Other major thing we need to do is remove list styling from this outer list. So you probably want a class for this particular thing, because the other thing we're going to do is create our grid layout. So let's do that next. Now for this, we're going to have to go into where we have the list. So we're going to have to add this class in a few places. I'm just going to call it grid. It's going to be the one and only grid we have for this application. And we need it a few places. We need it here, and then we also need it in our view for categories, which has essentially the same card layout. It's the other place we're using our source card. All right, so in my layout here, we will set us up for a grid. Now we know, again, we're considering the fact that this is our single-use application. We're not trying to make a framework that is shareable outside of this purpose. So we know that this grid is attached to a list. So we're going to remove list style. And this is one of those weird cases where we could use the role list, but it might just be adding noise. I'm not sure. It's kind of a gray area sometimes on whether to expose the fact that something is in fact a list in terms of for assistive technology. It's useful as for times that you want to provide somebody a count of things, which may be true in this scenario. I'm just trying to consider that we also are giving them a lot of links to navigate through. So I'm wondering if in that case, the list semantics is a bit of extra noise. Interested in other folks' thoughts. All right, so we're gonna do it this way. And we probably, if we were making a more extensive app, we would probably create a class to do this kind of a thing, but it's all good. All right, so we've just accomplished removing list styles. That's not too much here. Real quick, let's go back to our card. I would like to add a bit of, just for a starting place, some border so we can help identify the boundaries of our cards here. Okay, so for our actual grid then, we want it to be display grid. And then I'm going to go out to small CSS so we can copy from this, but also so you have a reference point for this particular technique if you would like to use it in the future. But we're going to use this responsive CSS grid idea. I certainly didn't invent this idea, but the idea of it is pretty cool. First of all, it's laying out our grid items kind of intrinsically, so based on their own sizes, but we've given it some parameters so that there is ultimately kind of a max width these can be allowed. But also the most important thing about this technique, or why it's so useful, is that it will automatically break items into new rows when they reach our different thresholds that we've defined, which is exactly the behavior that we would like for this particular grid. So I'm going to copy out this grid template columns line and add that in. I typically do a custom property here so that it can be changed in different contexts more easily. And we could go ahead and do that. We're probably not going to be changing it, but just as an organization technique, it's still kind of nice. And so this is what we've accomplished with that grid in place. So that's pretty good progress in just one line, right? That's why I love modern CSS. And so we'll just have to focus on a little more formatting of what's in here. The other thing we'll do, let's add some gap so that we have some space between items. We'll be a little bit generous with that. And before we go over and view it, and so that I don't keep triggering builds, I'm going to do a few more things within the card to style things up. Let's, though, have the HTML for that available. Okay, so within our card, we have this H3, and we have a nested list. Another thing I like to do is we have removed margin from everything currently between our reset and the styles we've already added. So what we can also do is for our card content, we can set this to display grid, and instead of adding margins back into things, we can again use gap to add a consistent margin between things, which is pretty handy. It doesn't mean, margin's not useful at all ever anymore, but in a card context, I think it makes a lot of sense. Works pretty well. Okay, so then the other thing we need to do before we get too far with this is we currently have this new count. Let's look at it in context. This new count, it's not tied up here, and we want that to align. So let's wrap that. It could be the header of our card, right? Kind of like to organize things in visual order. Except for, guess what? We hit an error with that, didn't we? Because we've already used the header as a generic element content. So we could fix this a couple ways. The quickest way we can fix this is to scope this down to the direct descendant of body. There we go. That resolved it. Know your element select, or know your CSS selectors. I have a series on that as well. which you can find. I have a couple actually. There's one off of Modern CSS, and then I also have a smashing article that goes over some of the newer selectors, pseudo-class selectors that we have available. So if you're confused about what I just did, this will help get you a little more information on that. All right, so now we're within the card and we're within the header. And in this case, we could do this a couple ways. Flex is nice because it's automatically going to make those jump up next to each other. But grid would also definitely be possible in this scenario. And I definitely go back and forth for this kind of a lockup. Grid, we can be more precise a little more easily on the width that we want, for example, this column to take, whereas flex just naturally is going to pick up the kind of inherent width of those children, which of course we haven't actually styled this number bubble yet. But let's start with flex. We'll do a nice align items center. Actually, we don't want to do align item center. We want to make sure that it's set at flex start. And the reason for that, if we go back and look at our wireframes, well, I don't know. I guess I'm torn. We're going to have some titles that are longer. If it's 3 lines, I'm not sure I'd still like it centered. So I might just have to let it be and decide as we actually get there with our styles. We're definitely not there yet to quite make that call. Cool. So the other thing we'd like to do is kind of fix up our list that we have in here. So this is the list of the individual items. And once again, I'm going to use grid. And there was a question on how gap is different than margin. A couple ways. Gap is going to, well, let's apply this and then we'll kind of look at it in the browser. It's going to take a minute to build, but we'll go ahead and open up Inspector. So, by the way, in your DevTools, it will actually, I'm in Chrome right now. Firefox has this as well, and I believe Safari added it, or it is coming in Safari 15, which was just announced last week. But anyway, it added these little identifiers for you to see what items are using grid or flex, which is pretty handy. So the other thing, if you click on the bubble, then it's going to persist this overlay. So gap versus margin. Gap is identified by this kind of shaded area with the diagonal lines. It might be a little difficult to see that pattern over the stream. But it's going to only apply between the grid items, just automatically. So we don't have to use to do something similar with CSS only. I would do something like this with the adjacent sibling selector, where I would apply, for example, margin top, right? But what if my context changes and I now have vertical alignment, right? Then I'd have to reconfigure this, worry about margin left instead or something like that. Whereas gap, based on the orientation of the grid, or now the orientation of Flexbox, because gap is now in Flexbox, it will automatically apply it between either flex or grid items. So I also then applied it to the list here. So same idea. So it's not going to add it to the outer edges. So if you still needed like additional room between specific pairings of content, you would still definitely use margin. Yep. So the between and not on the edge is a very critical difference as well. Yes. The other thing about flex versus grid, which by the way, I have recordings in my Twitch. If you go to the videos tab, I did a crash course basically on both flex and grid. If you're interested in those topics specifically, and then also in modern CSS, particularly in the earlier articles, I kind of compare both techniques for different scenarios. One more time, I'm going to use grid on our list items. Now, the main reason I'm picking grid, first of all, is that it has better gap support for now. The other reason is it automatically stacks things, which is what I would like in all of these contexts, whereas flex is going to, default alignment is row alignment. So, or column, however you'd like to think about it. I guess column would be, that's another difference between flex and grid. They use column and row differently. All right, so, okay, we're going to add in one more time. display grid. And again, if we weren't moving so quickly on this, we might pull this out into a little class, but it's fine for what we're doing today. I'm going to do a smaller gap on these grid items. So if we look at the internals of our list, we already have the new and date pulled out into its own element. So when this updates, there we go. It's we don't have to worry about this new being separated. We'd already dealt with that earlier. Cool. So that's probably a little bit too much gap. So maybe we don't even need a gap. Maybe just kind of the inherent line heights is fine. Cool. So let's actually take off that gap. And if we look at our wireframes, again, these weren't necessarily intended to be a design, but it's not too bad either. I'm not a designer, so I appreciate the tools. This tool I'm using is called Whimsical. So it made me make pretty boxes. All right, so, and we're already using, for example, the strong tags. We've already got some of our formatting just inherited from using HTML as it was intended, which, definitely do that as much as you can. And by the way, you kind of saw when I opened DevTools that it put our grid into action here. And, we're automatically having that breaking behavior and not having to add media queries. So pretty cool ability there. All right, I'm just kind of looking at this, deciding what we really need to get done. I think we do definitely want to separate out this view all. It's just visually not quite enough separation from the main list. And on our wireframe, we did kind of call that out as its own element. Now, one thing we have to do first, if we're going to do that, is adjust our padding so that it is not applied on the bottom, because we want it to snuggle the bottom there. And we did create that as a footer element. We're going to give that a border top of 1 pixel. And then we are going to add a tiny bit of padding. For something like this, I like to use M, so that way it's relative to the font size of that particular element. And we are going to set text alignment to center. I'm going to throw this in a small tag as well. Again, let's take advantage of HTML where we can. And then the style needs to save, and we'll see if we've accomplished what we needed from that. Almost. Oh, I need to take off left and right padding. Okay. So we're going to have to do something a little different. We could do this a few different ways. But for the sake of efficiency, let's go ahead and let's apply it to only our header and our list. So we'll move how we're applying that left and right padding, and then only apply padding top on our header. And it's still building. Oh, I overrode my style, didn't I? With my cascade in action. All right, so that should update. So we got most of the way there. We've got some extra space coming from somewhere here. But definitely these cards are more readable. It's not quite in a perfect state. Oh, this is due. So this is interesting. Behavior of grid is what we're seeing happen here. So since all of these elements are grid, we don't quite have subgrid yet. And subgrid's going to be the idea where, for example, we could define a grid that each of these card elements would pick up such that the header element in each of them would be a consistent height. And we kind of have to still hack around that a little bit. We're not going to worry about that behavior, but just to mention it. But what's happening with our footer here is that the default behavior of elements within this grid, and we see it also affecting kind of some spacing between these elements as well, is that they have stretch behavior. So, and that can be kind of unexpected when you're first starting to work with grid. One thing we can do, we can apply, I believe align self is what we want. Yep, align self end. So what's that done? What that has done is instead of allowing it to take up stretch behavior, which in other words, things are with stretch behavior kind of sharing the remaining leftover space of the grid, it's saying, no, shrink down to what the only space you need is. is effectively the outcome of doing this. So let's move that into our style over here. That was on the footer. And we're doing align self because it's an individual element within that grid. Whereas if we wanted to affect all items, we would do that up here. And actually we probably do. Let me check it in browser first, that I'm not forgetting something. So align items. Okay, yeah. So I'm going to align items start. You may or may not have seen exactly what that did. But especially for this one where it only had 2 items, it was actually appearing to add more item than we allotted with the gap because of that stretch behavior. Okay, so let's add that in. Start. And that's another difference from Flex. So Flex, we also have these align and justify type of properties, but with grid or in a Flex context, you would prepend it. But for grid, we just use start and end. Cool. So we definitely improved the readability here. We didn't quite get to our numbers. I will probably wrap up the numbers thing. Let's do this real quick. Let's add space between our sections. We're going to do that real simply. We know that this is the only H2 that we have in this view. And so in our layout, I'm going to use another. If I wasn't having to only do this in 1 minute, we'd probably move this to a typography file. But anyway, we'll do, and I think, do I have H2s and cards? I have H2s and cards later. So let's scope this to main. And we'll say the H2, now bear with me on this one, the H2 that is not first of type, we're going to add a margin top. And this is another area where I like to use viewport units. So we have a greater value on a larger viewport and a smaller value on a smaller one. So anyway, I usually start with 8 view heights for this scenario. And we'll see how this works. Okay, so what happened here, why I had to do that kind of slightly complex selector, is I didn't want it to apply to the first one. I also had to use the idea of not first of type, because since these aren't sequentially located, but they are both direct descendants of main. So that's how that was able to apply. So you can see it applies basically to everyone that's not the first. So another way CSS and its inherent functionality and selectors works really nice for us. So that's pretty good. We might ultimately want to put some sort of constraint on this scenario where we don't have enough to fill up our 3-column grid. What we kind of accomplished, let's just recap. We had a couple additional templating things that we did at the top of the stream to wrap up getting some data. And we mostly focused on just being able to align things in a grid. We ended up focusing on grid quite a bit, it seemed like, getting our base style started. But all these views are already in place. We can jump back to the previous recorded streams. Okay, so what we accomplished was kind of styling up our cards to an extent. There's definitely some improvements to be made, but I hope you learned some new things, even for what we were able to accomplish. And what I will continue working on a little bit, again, I'm not going to have time to stream the rest of the progress here, is completing out the views for individual pages, which this isn't too bad. We'll probably just add, and then our biggest thing that we unfortunately didn't get to is dialing up individual item pages. But even just our, application of controlling width helped. We'll probably reduce that down even more. The main things I'll be looking to do, I need to remove this duplicate date, style things like code, style things like maybe iframes that will come in, because I definitely saw that in, here we go. We even got like a code pen that made it through the RSS. If you're not familiar with RSS as much, the author decides what content can go through. So they may decide to send down the entire article, in which case we're getting, embeds and everything. Or for some of my things on Eleventy Rocks, either they're shorter or they're actually links to other additional resources in, I think, like this one. So it's not an article even, it's just an extra link. So you never know what's going to come down. So I will be providing a bit more styles for this. And that way it will be ready to be used as a starter. And then I will have another commit in the near future. Not next week sometime to try to adjust the styling just a bit more so it's more ready for someone to use as a starter.